Welcome to The Human Edge. This week's guest is Paul van Zyl. Paul's career began in South Africa as Executive Secretary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an appointment made by Nelson Mandela, and where Paul found himself working day to day with Archbishop Desmond Tutu. These days, Paul is co-founder of The Conduit, a members club in central London that is dedicated to changing the world. This conversation, as you can imagine from that, was absolutely incredible. I don't want to say too much more about it. I hope you love it as much as I did. If you do, please like, please share, please subscribe, all of that good stuff. It will be massively helpful. Thank you. Paul, thanks so much for coming in. I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for a long time. I suppose South Africa is the place to begin. You grew up in apartheid South Africa. Which I'm assuming was a really formative experience for you. Before we dive into that, for those that don't know, what was South Africa like at the time?
I mean, I grew up from the perspective of a white South African in apartheid South Africa, so it's like the Garden of Eden. An enormous amount of comfort and privilege. Many people lived in leafy gardens with swimming pools. My parents were academics, so they weren't bankers or doctors, but we led a wonderful middle class life. I walked to school. We had my schools were beautiful with soccer pitches and swimming pools and the right number of kids per class, and if you didn't know everything that was happening outside the enclave of privileged white apartheid South Africa, it would feel like paradise.
But
a few kilometers away from where that paradise sat, the majority of the people in the country had been forced off their land, deprived of a decent education, placed into the least desirable parts of the country, given substandard housing, made to work for slave wages. And South Africa in the 1970s its economy grew at the fastest rate in the world, second only to Japan, and the Gini coefficient, the difference between the richest and the poorest, was the highest in the world. And South Africa presided over the world's largest stockpiles of gold and platinum and uranium and diamonds, and developed a relatively sophisticated manufacturing economy, all on the back of wildly exploited, cheap black labor, and the system was designed to do that.
So I was, because you became quite active in the anti-apartheid movement, and I was wondering where that came from, because the way you described your upbringing, I was maybe imagining that your parents were activists or campaigners. Was there anything of that going on at home?
I was very fortunate. My parents, from as early as I can remember, told me that apartheid was wrong and evil. And some of my earliest memories growing up as a child were my parents having arguments with my grandfather in particular about apartheid, because he was an enthusiast for apartheid and a defender of it, and my parents weren't. So at our dinner tables, there was an enormous amount of conversation about politics and about apartheid. My parents were at a university which a quarter of the students were black, and was a sort of a center of resistance to the apartheid regime. So I think I was always going to be a lawyer from as early as I can remember. And there was always a sense I would be a lawyer because I would then, use my skills to oppose apartheid. And so when I went to university, the expectation was that I would do so. But I think the thing that was really striking, and it's a kind of broad, I think, lesson or reflection about the difference between objecting to something or disagreeing with something and activism, is when I got to university, I decided to become politically involved. And to be honest, before I knew what politically involved really meant, I thought it would be a kind of glorified debating society. It would be standing up like the Oxford Union and saying, and this house believes that apartheid is evil and separate but equal is a lie. And what activism really was about was the black student activists at our university being rounded up at 2 o'clock in the morning by the security police, detained without trial under existing security legislation, abducted, tortured, disappeared, and some of them never coming home.
Yeah.
And so you got a much greater and more intense sense of what struggle in human rights work was like. It wasn't anything but a debating society. It was life and death. And black students were at the forefront and very much at risk, but there was a small group of white students, and I was amongst them, who became intensely politically involved, and we began to witness that the separation that I described to you earlier about the Garden of Eden and an incredibly exploitative society was enforced and maintained by violence and by coercion. And the activists who rose up against it were subjected to that violence and coercion.
I'm imagining, so black students being rounded up, tortured, murdered. I'm imagining it was also dangerous for white students and white activists too. Were you confronted with that yourself personally?
Yes, I mean, the student movement that I was part of had leaders who were themselves arrested, detained, tortured. A professor in our university was assassinated by a hit squad who was white. So the regime had two different standards. They tried not to torture and kill white people in the way that they tortured and killed black people, but you were certainly in the firing line, and they reserved a particular, you constitute a particular threat to them because it was dissent from within. So every year about 100,000 white men were conscripted into the South African military. And I'm not a pacifist. I believe that there are things that are absolutely worth fighting for, and I'd be prepared to fight for things. But I wasn't prepared to fight for that particular military. So I became a conscientious objector. And at that point, you were on a very small list because it was 0.01% of white men objected. And you then were subject to particular scrutiny. I led a campaign to occupy whites-only schools, and started getting death threats and were being followed around and was put on another list and then was arrested and prosecuted. A car that I was traveling in to attend a court hearing was sprayed with semi-automatic weapon fire and spun off the highway. So there were risks, but it was definitely nowhere near the risks that black students faced.
Yeah. I'm pausing because it's a really sobering period of time in South African history and human history. A few years later, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed, and again, people listening or watching this podcast may never have heard of that. So it was set up by Nelson Mandela. What was its purpose?
Well, I just described some of the violence that occurred under apartheid. And when Nelson Mandela was freed from prison in February of 1990, there was a sense that with a fair wind, he was likely to become South Africa's next president. And as the negotiations ensued and as that became more and more likely, the question arose, what do we do with the crimes that occurred under apartheid? We can't just sweep them under the carpet. We can't hold Nuremberg tribunals because, unlike after World War II, the Nazis had not been defeated in South Africa. In fact, they were at the heart of government. And F.W. de Klerk, who negotiated the end of apartheid with Nelson Mandela, was the vice president alongside with him. So a compromise was reached, and the compromise was that amnesty would be granted to those people who committed political crimes. But unlike in Latin America, in Argentina or in Chile, where amnesties were granted, which were sort of blanket amnesties, this amnesty was a conditional one. And the condition attached to it, after a lot of negotiation and legal ingenuity, which is another story, was that you could get amnesty if you came forward and told the truth. And so what the Truth Commission did was, on the one hand, give victims a chance to tell their stories, investigated the crimes, who did what to whom, told a story about our nation's history in a way that people would never be able to forget or deny, and hopefully there would never again be these crimes that occurred against our people, but also gave the perpetrators an incentive to come forward and reveal the truth that they would otherwise withhold by incentivizing them to do so, on the assumption that if they told the truth, they would get amnesty. So it was a very delicate and ingenious compromise. It said there's a stick of prosecution and there's a carrot of amnesty, and for that you must deliver to us the truth. And so the Truth Commission operated for close to 4 years, took 24,000 statements, listened to several thousand victims in live testimony tell their stories, was the newsmaker of the year for 3 years in a row, had higher viewership than the football, the soccer. So was something that had the entire nation's attention. It was a kind of morality play for the country. And most importantly of all, it was a pressure valve. Because Nelson Mandela, when he was elected, had been in Robben Island for 27 years, and he had the task of governing a country that was deeply divided, but that needed to address the grievances and needs of black South Africans and reassure white South Africans that there was a place for them in the new South Africa. And so governing that was no small feat. But if Nelson Mandela were to have to every day turn around and say, well, who tortured who and who killed who and who disappeared who and how far up did it go and were the colleagues in the cabinet also responsible and did they know, then it would distract him from governing. So what he was able to do was create a post box. And the post box was the Truth Commission. And every time he had a piece of correspondence which indicated that something bad had happened, he just posted that to us. On the other side of that post box was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, fellow Nobel Prize winner and my boss, who then received it and said, I will deal with this. But we will deal with this in a safe, thoughtful, and responsible way. And I think that made all the difference. In fact, in some ways, it made the transition from the apartheid era to the new democratic era possible, because it was a safe, high-integrity place that everybody trusted that would be able to deal with these crimes.
As you were talking, so maybe Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the shorthand for that is Truth Commission. But I'm wondering, yes, people told the truth. How successful was it in terms of the reconciliation part as well? Maybe that's an ongoing story.
Well, the first question is a definitional issue in terms of what constitutes reconciliation. And you could imagine, you could explain reconciliation two different ways. You could describe it as what happens between two people when a particular event has occurred, a crime or a piece of wrongdoing. And if you and I were to be in an altercation, or you were to commit a crime against me, or the other way around, there might be a particular architecture that would govern how reconciliation between us might happen. And the interesting thing about that is that there's no universal formula because we're all different.
Yeah.
So some people are inclined to forgive, some people will never forgive, some people will forgive under certain circumstances, some people will require apologies, other people will require compensation, other people require the passage of time, other people will want to see a more societal or a communal level transformation before it happens. So the first thing is, it's almost impossible to develop a universal formula or an algorithm for reconciliation at an individual level.
Yes.
And it's, for that reason, even more difficult to think about it at a national or a societal level. That being said, you could define reconciliation as an absence of things. So people are not killing each other. People are not contesting the rules of a new society. They bought into a set of agreements about democracy or rights or constitutional frameworks or cohabitation. And if you adopt a sort of more relaxed view of reconciliation, which is an absence of killing and an end to conflict and the prevention of war, then South Africa reconciled superbly. And then at a more individual level, there were many, many instances of individual reconciliation, but there were many, if not an equal number of instances where a person said, "You murdered my son, and I will never forgive you." And that's an entirely legitimate question. So it's a long answer, but it's, I think, a way of saying we succeeded in making a new country possible. We weren't the only thing that made a new country possible, but I like to think that we were a very important part of it. And we facilitated an absence of hatred, anger, and bitterness in many individual cases, and gave people a sense that although it may not have been criminal or retributive justice, in the sense that people went to prison, there was a more broad sense of restorative justice. And that made a difference. And I think in some way, even having the conversation about whether reconciliation happened and according to what standard and to what extent is a form of reconciliation itself. Because while you're having that conversation, you're not killing people. And that's progress.
So from a personal perspective, during those 4 years, you were executive secretary on the commission. Kind of witness to the 24,000 cases that you were talking about. And I'm trying to put myself in what would have been your shoes at the time. The purpose of it, incredibly noble. And necessary, but at the same time, I'm imagining it would have been so tough for anybody to sit through and to listen, especially the live testimony, to listen to mothers and husbands and of people who were taken from them. So I suppose my question is, how were you able to ensure that you? Because it goes straight to the soul when you're hearing things like that day in, day out. And I think you said, one of the things you said is the process was to kind of heal the soul of South Africa. How did you ensure your own soul was strong throughout the process? You didn't succumb to the darkness.
Everybody has their own coping mechanism. The Commission took the mental health of its employees quite seriously. We had a staff of trained clinical psychologists in every one of our major offices who developed a mental health program for the staff. That went so far, but more than half the commissioners got cancer during the course of the Commission. The translators who did the simultaneous translation into our back and forth from South Africa's 11 national languages had their hair fall out and their teeth fall out and develop post-traumatic stress because they were literally speaking the words of both victims and perpetrators to each other and were having to be the ventriloquists for the country. And Archbishop Tutu, in the very first hearing, sort of collapsed in tears and then resolved never to do that again because it drew the attention to him and away from victims, and he didn't want that to happen. So it was very, very tough. I, at different points, stepped away from physically attending all the hearings and worked on the kind of legal and policy and operational stuff that was within my remit, because firstly to sit 40 hours a day passively listening, 40 hours a week listening to that was inefficient because I had other things to do, but also because it was a real tax, and so there was a sense of self-preservation there.
It would be remiss of me not to ask you about those two great figures, historical figures you mentioned, Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. What could you? I mean, I'm sure you could talk for the rest of the podcast about them. What stands out for you most about each of them?
Nelson Mandela was a truly great, regal leader. When you met Mandela, you felt that you were in the presence of somebody who had his eyes on the horizon all the time and was almost destined for greatness. It sounds like a cliche, but he thought in wise ways. He thought about the national interest. He thought above party politics. He was capable of humor and anger and fallibility like all the rest of us. But he was always trying to marshal consensus for a greater good. And he was measured and thoughtful, and he was the essential glue that made the new South Africa possible. And there's just, if you think about the caliber of leadership we have in the world today, and you think about Nelson Mandela, you cannot have a greater study in contrast. And the world would do itself such an enormous favor if the existing leadership emulated some of his traits. Don't seek to divide, don't polarize, don't stir up anger and resentment, don't take the most vulnerable and use their sense of weakness and vulnerability and anger and exclusion as a way to gin them up, but do exactly the opposite. Just really lots and lots of highly applicable lessons. Archbishop Tutu had many of those attributes as well. He was much more religious than Mandela, saw the world through the Bible and through Christ, and had a very kind of redemptive sort of philosophy. He also had a kind of wicked sense of humor. He was sort of your naughty uncle to Nelson Mandela, but had an absolutely unfailing moral compass. He was always, when you confronted him with difficult, hard, excruciating choices, some of them to his own detriment, he would make the difficult choice, not the easy choice. And he managed to deploy the kind of redemptive characteristics of some brands of Christianity in a way that was not alienating or exclusionary and not sectarian. And I think that was very, very, both appropriate because South Africa is a country which was overwhelmingly Christian, but he did it in a way that didn't let people in the Jewish community or Muslims feel that they were being stomped on by a hegemonic religion. So it was wonderful in that regard as well.
You had two incredible role models for you then, and I'm sure in your work then and subsequently you've kind of been in conversation with many great leaders and maybe many that aren't. You're in a leadership position and have been for many years. How do you see your own leadership?
It would be trite to say that you try and take the lessons from Mandela and Tutu and apply it in your own life. But I think that firstly, I at the end of the Truth Mission, I set up a large NGO. We worked in 30 countries around the world. Mm-hmm. We helped build the field of transitional justice, the way in which nations deal with the legacy of massive atrocity. We helped codify that field and make it a field of practice. And a part of transitional justice was how you look back and how you seek to restore dignity to victims and ensure that mass atrocity doesn't occur again in a way that brings people together and creates healthy, vibrant, prosperous societies. And I was always in that work seeking to apply Mandela and Tutu, Mandela in the sort of broad, grow the pie, stable statesman mode, and Tutu in the redemptive, bare your soul, own up to your responsibilities, heal through revealing kind of ways. And so that was very, very directly applicable.
Yes.
I now run a business with a deep social mission, and I think the two applicable lessons are, one, try run your leadership team and the group of people who run the business in a way that isn't coercive or divisive or authoritarian. Try and run a place with inspiration and passion and love more than fear and kind of probing scrutiny. But also, I think in the kind of values of the place. So, we have a set of values which are Ubuntu, which is I am because we are, an African philosophy which says that we are better, more generous, more wise, more creative, more entrepreneurial, more resilient, happier when we affirm the connections between ourselves. And I think that is an essential part of how you build and run healthy teams, is to suppress ego and make people feel as though they're part of a collective effort, and their job as an employee is to help each other more than to get ahead, and that you get ahead by helping people, not by competing with them or scrabbling over them in order to get ahead.
You mentioned love just now, and I loved the way you mentioned it. And maybe it's especially difficult for many men to talk about the necessity of kind of love in the workplace. It's clearly part of kind of your set of values. Have you seen it successfully applied elsewhere?
I think that when you look at I think that there are a set of very kind of purpose-driven leaders who will put their companies on North Star, give them a North Star. And those North Stars will be extremely strong on values and on orientation. And the reason why I'm pausing is because I think there can be a disconnect between a stated set of aspirations for what you want the company to be in the world and how it actually runs and how people trust and engage with each other. And to be honest, it's not an easy thing, if you think about being in the hospitality industry, where people are transient, where there's a high level of turnover, where people work long hours, where you've got people who are in a scullery or a barman or a waiter or greeting people at the door, where turning those environments into environments of affirmation and humanity and love and dignity is easier said than done.
Yes.
And I think people all too easily just say it without actually meaning it. And I think we have spent a fair amount of time trying to walk the walk, and sometimes haven't got it right. I think we're getting better and better at figuring out how to walk the walk. And so I think, to answer your question more completely, I think it's one thing to say what kind of a place you are, and it's another thing to be that place. And I think that's a test of kind of authentic leadership, is can you be what you say you are.
Yeah. I want to give you the opportunity to talk more about the conduit, actually, because we're kind of circling around it a little bit. So I know what it is, but for the audience, can you give it a little bit of history? And also, I'm really keen to understand the vision, 5 years, 10 years, 20, whatever that might look like for the conduit.
Well, I mean, in some ways, there's a kind of through line from the Truth Commission to the conduit, and it's sort of useful to maybe think about it for a moment. One chapter of my life was trying to move us from authoritarian to democratic societies, from societies characterized by conflict to societies that have a deeper sense of peace and harmony and stability. You can move from bad state A to good state B and leave your citizens in a state of poverty and immiseration, and have the world on an unsustainable path in which the lives of future generations are genuinely in enormous jeopardy, but still have dealt with mass atrocity. You can have an unsustainable planet in which genocide doesn't happen. Unsustainable planets are also more conflict prone, open and closed parentheses, but the two things are possible. And so one of the things that I think the conduits exist to do is to try and create a community of people, and our mission is to accelerate solutions to the world's biggest problems and to build a just, prosperous and sustainable world. And we do that by creating a club in the first instances. We have several thousand people who are members. They arrive in Covent Garden on a daily and weekly basis. They go to talks, they meet each other, they connect, they are interested in trying to forge solutions to the world's biggest problems. And the kind of conduit is a sort of ecosystem. And the ecosystem theory is, if you set up a community of people for that purpose and you sprinkle it with content and you create a capital arm which will allow people to access finance to be able to support their entrepreneurial endeavors, then they'll self-organize in accordance with the things that they care about. So the climate folks will meet the climate folks, and the sustainable fashion people will meet sustainable fashion, and the people in regenerative agriculture, and the people in new forms of food, and the people in impact investing, and people who are working in insurance as a form of good will coalesce together, and you meet them at the bar or at a talk or in one of your cohorts or in an affinity group. And we try and find as many ways as possible of getting people to engineer serendipity, to get people to encounter each other. And then you say, well, the world's biggest challenges are going to be where concerned people get together and don't lead passive lives, but try and put food on their table and care for their families, but also do good at the same time. So that's what the conduit tries to do. And we're now trying to do that in a much more concerted, proactive way. I can talk about that a little later if you'd like. But it's Ubuntu in action. It's a community of people working to try and build a more positive future.
Yeah. I'm thinking about things from an entrepreneurial perspective right now, where the conduit's concerned. So the problems of the world are so big and vast. And what you're setting out to achieve is hoping to kind of tackle all of those, huge problems, or maybe a small part of them. Do you ever kind of fall into the the mindset of, well, we're here, the problems are so vast, it's impossible to be able to tackle the world's problems in the way that we want to do?
Look, I have a stump speech that I give, which is like the 10 horsemen of the apocalypse.
Yeah.
And you can go through them, and it's, climate change, inequality, pandemics, great world conflicts, erosion of confidence in democracy, disinformation and misinformation, high levels of indebtedness, massive problems with employment and structural unemployment arising from these great technologies, most particularly AI, which may render entire categories of the labor market completely obsolete.
Yeah.
You can go on.
Yeah, don't depress us too much.
But so that's a useful scene to go, right, that's, and that's before the advent of 2025, which is in some ways poured fuel on the fire, right? And then you can say, okay, but what are our assets if those are the horsemen dragging us to the apocalypse, right? And our assets are, if you were to choose a moment in human history from the perspective of innovation and technological breakthrough, it would be right now in terms of the speed and scale at which they're occurring. It's capable of great evil. There are lots of worrying things about it, but it's, it took 20 years to develop a vaccine, and we can now do it in 3 months. We are poised to develop vaccines for cancer. We can restore eyesight to people through neuroimaging. Deafness should no longer be an obstacle for anybody. We have the possibility to extend human longevity by decades, potentially. Every one of the kind of climate challenges can be addressed by nuclear fission, by molecular biology, by material science. Half of our energy wasted because of inefficiency, AI can solve for that if we create adaptive grids and interesting renewable energies and long-term battery storage. So you could, now I'm all of a sudden in the optimist camp, right? And so what I think this moment does is says we have innovation, we have capital, and then the most important thing we do is we have humans. And I think, to come back to Mandela and Tutu, my bet is that humans are capable of enormous evil, but we're capable of greater good. And the real thing that we have to do now is put a thumb on the scale for good. And I think if you look at this moment in history, what a particular set of odious leaders have done is they've put a thumb on the scale for evil and divisiveness, for their own agendas. And that requires us, like under apartheid, to stand up. And that standing up means that we have to use all of the assets that we have. And then I'll say, what makes these things hard is that we're running out of time. So, if we had another 100 years and we could do all of this at a leisurely clip, in the context of all the technological advances that we're currently experiencing, I'd be very optimistic. What makes me feel very, very urgent in how we do this is that we're running out of time. And so we're in this sort of like moment, when you're like on a conveyor belt, a treadmill, and it's accelerating and you have to sprint. And the real question is, do you run ahead, or does the treadmill throw you off the back? And I think in some ways, the treadmill is technology. And we've got to make sure that that technology puts wind in our sails, doesn't force us backwards. And if we can do it correctly, I think we can address the world's great challenges. But that will also require that human beings govern themselves well. And that means we have to live in stable societies, we have to be decent to each other, we have to build strong democratic systems, we have to think about how you change bad systems into good systems. And all of this requires patience and entrepreneurship and ingenuity and goodwill, which kind of brings us back to what we're trying to do at the Conduit, which is create those building blocks and put on our trainers and say, if you lace up those shoes every day, you'll get better at it. And if we collectively get better at it, we put 2x behind us because we're more affected as a group than we are just doing it in our own little atomized lives.
Yeah, the sense of urgency is real and it's palpable, and so we're running out of time collectively. In terms of what you want to do, you're running out of time, right? Because you're a human being, and unfortunately, we live finite lives. A morbid question, because it's just come to me. If we were speaking in however many decades' time, and you were on your deathbed, and looking back, what would make you content in the way that you've? That's not an elegantly worded question. Looking back, thinking I've done my bit. What would that look like?
I think I am more and more drawn to this idea of trying to affect large-scale problems through systemic interventions, that when you tweak the system, the problem is resolved by the operation of the system, not by having to get up every day and solve it again. So let me give an example that we're working on right now. Right now, 1 in 8 homes in the UK are at risk of flooding. And this is directly correlated with climate change, but floods killed people in Valencia and in New Orleans and in the Carolinas and in Florida and all around the world and all the time.
Yes.
And right now we spend billions of pounds every year in the UK building seawalls and dams to get ahead of this problem. And the problem is the nature of climate change and increased precipitation and wetness means that we don't have the money and the hard infrastructure to get ahead of the problem, and it's getting worse all the time. But there is actually a rather magical solve, which is natural flood management and the building of wetlands. And wetlands have this remarkable capability, and guess who's perfected them? The Dutch, to soak up water and act as a natural sponge, but also have all these incredible climate co-benefits.
Yes.
Carbon sequestration, biodiversity net gain, because species love wetlands, birds and insects and animals. Water quality improves, nasty nutrients that shouldn't be in the water are taken out of the water. And we've also, through a little bit of human ingenuity and good public policy, created a set of monetary flows that go to natural assets which throw off these climate co-benefits. So if you just took our existing billions of pounds of money that we invest in anti-flood and reallocate a portion of it to natural flood management and wetlands, and then took the climate co-benefits off those wetlands and put them in a fund,
Yes.
and then took the insurance industry's large corpus of investable assets and occasioned them to invest those money together with government into building 1,000 wetlands across the UK, then you would create a net drawdown and a set of important climate benefits, but you'd also avoid, through investment of hundreds of millions of pounds, billions and billions of pounds of flood damage. So you have these kind of super wins on many, many different levels. That's what we're working on right now. In fact, just yesterday we had the launch of that initiative at the Conduit.
Fantastic.
And that's a system change, because once you set up a body which has the land owners, the engineers, the measurement people, the data analysts, the government bodies, the financiers, all of them together, then that system starts acting in a way that allocates capital rationally towards good ends, right? And we're used to systems being, they can be evil and authoritarian, right? Vladimir Putin's Russia is an evil system being deployed against the interests of humanity. A reflooding system would be a system that wakes up every morning and allocates resources in the interests of humanity. So if I, sat on my deathbed in many, many decades to come, I would want to have bequeathed a number of those systems. So transitional justice and the way we deal with it, mass atrocity, is a system. It exists beyond me, but we bequeathed it. and a system of an ecosystem like the Conduit, which births entrepreneurs who are doing good, is a system, and reflooding is a system. And I'm determined to set up as many of those systems as I can, contribute to as many as I can while I can.
And a wonderful answer. Turning towards home in terms of the final strata of the podcast,
Yeah.
it's called the human edge for a reason, which is I love to explore with my guests. What I want to show, and it's of a theme on this for this conversation, what I wanted to show for the audience is that my guests, they may be successful, but they are just as human as everyone else, with their own insecurities, their own vulnerabilities, etc., etc. So, from the lens of you as a leader, what kind of insecurities or vulnerabilities have you had to overcome along the way?
I think I've had to learn that you need to firstly bring people along with you. That, I think there's a kind of trope of leadership that's prevalent, identifiable, shall I say, diagnosable, which is a group of people who perhaps can see around the corner and have a clear sense of, I feel deeply motivated, passionate, are capable of inspiring, are wanting to make change. And I think those leaders are really important in the world, but those leaders can also be exhausting and messianic and in it for themselves. And so I think you have to learn to lead in a way that brings people along and that makes it not all about you, and forges teams and suppresses ego. And I think that those are lessons that are hard won. And so that's I'm not trying to be sort of revelatory and self-reflexive or self-flagellating to say that I have been those things, but I think that those are things that you have to guard against and be aware of, because you're ineffective unless you are. And then I think there's another thing, which is the gap between seeing a problem at a sort of high level and taking that high level problem and going down 10 levels to get it right. I read a column by Jay Rayner, the erstwhile food critic for The Guardian, in his first article for the Financial Times, where he's now their new food critic. And he said, great restaurants are an amalgamation where a great many small things are done well. And he gave an example of that when you get a glass of champagne, the glass is chilled. Or when people change the cloths on a table, it's like the nurse changing a sheet in a hospital bed. It's done with great care and precision. And so I think there's, and I run a place which is a place of hospitality, and the teams of people who are at the human face, the people who are good at it are phenomenally good at it. And it's because they are going right down to what do you want right now, and how do I help you right now? And sometimes it's just a coffee or a glass of water, or the room's too hot. And so the distance between that and system change, decarbonizing the planet, is huge. And social change requires that entire gulf to be, that chasm to be bridged. And I think that leaders who sit up here are often insufficiently attentive of what it requires at the coalface, and are sort of a little bit belittling what happens at the coalface, because they think it's sort of, that's just the trivia, the ordinary people are just doing that, and it's actually completely wrong. It's the ordinary people doing that, which are actually making the change, or building the wetlands, or measuring the carbon, or, caring for the frogs. So I think being attentive to the full stretch of stuff is a really important lesson for leadership.
How do you do that?
Make sure you have absolutely excellent people in good divisions of labor. Make sure that you have as many remarkable executors on your team as you do have visionaries and rainmakers. And make sure that you don't create a invisible hierarchy between them or devalue one of them in favor of the other.
I'm put in mind of, I invoke Stephen Bartlett quite a bit when talking about this podcast for obvious reasons with the Diary of a CEO, but he talks passionately about the 1%, he's very focused on the small stuff. So you hear don't sweat the small stuff, he's the opposite. Yeah. Every 1% counts. And it sounds like in terms of ensuring that that huge distance that you're talking about is covered from top to bottom, you have to have a team of people that cares passionately about every single little detail about what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's if you think about just it's also why it's such a miracle that we actually get up and do anything every day, right? The sheer complexity of running with 100 employees, a members club that 150,000 people walk through every year, right? You've got to go down to what is the cost of the oranges that are in your orange juice, and where do you source them from, and what's their carbon footprint if you care about that.
Yes.
And then who squeezes them at what time for maximum freshness in order to make sure that members have a good experience, to which Nobel Prize winning speaker do you book for your talks, to which companies help raise capital from which investors on which days, with which entrepreneurs who are pre-qualified in what way, to what food do you serve on the 5th floor, and what group of people are in your co-working space, and what are the national insurance premiums that have to be paid as a result of a new government's labor laws that are intended to bridge a fiscal gap left by the prior government, which are nevertheless make things very difficult for existing entrepreneurs. So, welcome to my life.
Yes.
Right? And
But you're not asking yourself all of those questions. You may be asking one or two of them. I'm assuming most of those questions are being asked by your team or the teams below your team.
Yes, but to your 1% illusion is, if I don't know that those are issues, then I'm probably not being a good CEO, right? So I have to know that the orange question is a cost of goods sales question, which links to the input prices, which contribute to the overall profitability of my business. And if the oranges are too expensive, we go out of business. Yes. Or if we don't appropriately price the orange juice, right? And then you think, what a tawdry, difficult thing to have to think about when you're trying to think about reflooding and human rights and the rights of migrants and the other stuff that we're doing. But that stuff matters, right? And also, is my reception team happy and cheerful, and do they smile when people come through the door and give them a good experience? And when they've taken the 217th coat that day, do they still feel delighted by giving you back counter C63 when you come back and have lost it? Yes. And still feel motivated to come back to work because they feel as though they're working for an endeavour that is not just a coach check-in at a Hilton hotel or the Four Seasons or Claridge's. It's also a place where you're doing good in the world, and they can feel proud of it, and they can tell their friends about it, and they feel as though they're a valued part of the team. So all of that is what leadership requires. I don't have to do everything every day, but I have to have a big picture sense that those things are being attended to. If I'm not, then I'm not leading.
Yeah. Clearly the vision and the mission are incredibly motivating and energizing for you.
Yeah.
But like every other human being, you will have kind of dips of energy, maybe become disconnected temporarily from the vision, from the purpose. What are your practices? What do you do to kind of to center yourself, to reconnect to yourself, to re-energize yourself?
I think my answer is probably not going to be like a best practice answer.
I'm looking for what you do. That's all.
I work more.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I feel disconnected, or if I feel that that things are not going perfectly, I respond to it by working more to try and address it. And in some senses, that's like, well, self-evident. Why wouldn't you do that if you're an entrepreneur or a leader? But I think I'm trying to learn more and more to zoom in and zoom out at the right moment. So I did an interview a couple of months ago with Dan Labud, who is the CEO of the Crown Estate. Super fascinating guy, very impressive. And he described his leadership as sort of like, these are my words, not his, but sort of hovering and then swooping in. And swooping in is to sort of to look at the macro view of the business, and always sort of trying to say what's going well and what are the key drivers and what are the things we need to be doing and being attended to, and then swooping in to work at a specific project in the Crown Estate in this particular locality, trying to solve this particular thing, even if it's like retrofitting a building in Essex, I don't know, right? And that sense of being deep down at the people at the coal face and then going all the way up is, I think, a very helpful way to attend to the 1% question, because you don't know what you don't know as a leader unless you're actually doing it.
Yeah.
And secondly, I think it can also give you a refresh. Give you a sense that you're doing something a little different, and seeing things from the perspective of different people, and that gives you a sense of a kind of health check on both your people and your business.
Is there a cost that is associated with almost doubling down, working harder?
Yes, definitely. You work too hard. So I think, I think that I think it would be a very interesting thing. I've just never had it in my life, to be a sort of person who goes, I'm going to work from 9 in the morning till 5, and then I'm going to switch off and be in a different mode. That is not something that's familiar to me. And I think there are definitely costs to that. And I think I have resolved to try and boundary things in better ways. And I think that that's a work in progress. But it's definitely a resolution.
Yeah. That might lead us on to the final question, coming back to the human edge and insecurities. And what's your edge currently? You can think about it in terms of the thing that, or this kind of situation, or maybe even the type of people that you're with, that makes you feel uncomfortable. What does that look like for you right now?
I mean, I think we're on a very, very precarious edge on the planet that has direct ramifications for everything that I do. So I think the conduit is a sort of canary in a global coal mine in some ways, because we have had a moment where some of the most remarkable advances in the human condition feel as though they're being reversed in a wildly disingenuous, dangerous way. And you see all the things you try and do in the world, right? I'm incredibly passionate about the rights of refugees and migrants. And you look at the demagoguery and demonization of that group of vulnerable people and what that means for the world. And it's not just horrendous as an act of humanity. It's also wildly stupid and counterproductive. And the most effective, prosperous, remarkable nations are ones that welcome people in and draw on diversity and think about human capital as the best thing you could ever. It's a gift. Humans are a gift. Yes. They're not objects to be, driven out of your society. So it's counterproductive and dangerous. We're reversing on climate. The peace dividend that we've experienced since the end of World War II and the inhumanity of the Holocaust is gone. And we're now rearming. Just think of this for a moment. Germany is passed a budget resolution a week ago, which enables it, in the face of a constitutional prohibition previously of spending money above a certain cap, something which has been core to the economic consensus in Germany for several decades since the war. It has now passed a constitutional provision which allows it to spend a limitless amount of money on arms.
Oh.
And that's probably a good thing. Because if Germany rearms, it means that Russian aggression and the naked intrusions that you've seen in Ukraine and which could very well be elsewhere can be stopped. And so you ask me why I'm on edge. I'm on edge because I'm celebrating the rearmament of Germany. I shouldn't be celebrating the rearmament of Germany, right? And there's so many other moments of paradox right now in the world, and I'd still conclude by saying, on balance, I'm an enormous optimist, and on balance, I think we'll win. But what it requires us to be, and I like the idea of edge because I think it's a really powerful metaphor, is we have to be on the edge all the time as humans. We have to be right up on the edge if we are to bequeath our children, not just a better world, a livable one. And so, I'd like to be on the edge. I'd like to be a little bit away from the edge, frankly. But it's required that we are on it and standing guard for the foreseeable future.
There's no finer place to end the conversation. Thanks so much for coming in, Paul. It was worth the wait. Let's put it that way.
Great pleasure, and sorry to have kept you waiting.
Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you.